He looked at my hands before he looked at my face. Not the wine glass I was holding, not the dress. My hands, checking, I think, whether they still shook the way they used to. They didn't. "You're presenting tonight?" he said, like the words didn't fit together right in his mouth. "I'm the keynote," I said. Small world. His face did the thing faces do when the ground turns out not to be where you left it. "My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 40. I run a robotics lab at a research hospital in Denver, Colorado, developing adaptive prosthetic control systems for amputees. 6 years ago, I was the one who needed them. I lost my right arm below the elbow in a car accident on I-70, ice on the road, a jackknifed truck, a decision made in half a second that changed the rest of my life. I was 34. I'd been married to Paul Whitfield for 7 years. Paul stayed for 4 months. Then he left. I want to tell you exactly how because the how matters more than people think. Not clinically. Helping with a sleeve, steadying an elbow, that kept happening. I mean, touching me like a husband touches a wife. That stopped in week 3, and it never came back. I noticed. I didn't say anything because I told myself grief takes strange shapes and this was his. By month 3, he'd started staying late at the office. By month 4, I found out from a mutual friend, not from him, that the office had a name, Danielle Reyes, an associate at his firm, 29, unbroken in every visible way. I remember the exact moment I understood how far things had already gone. I found a receipt in his coat pocket while looking for my phone charger. Dinner for 2, a restaurant downtown. Dated a night he'd told me he was working late alone. I didn't confront him with the receipt. I just held onto it for 2 weeks, the way you hold on to proof you're not ready to use yet. I confronted him on a Tuesday night in our kitchen, my new prosthetic sitting on the counter charging, my real arm ending 4 inches below where it used to. "Is there someone else?" He just packed 2 suitcases with the same careful folding he used for his work shirts. Like the process of packing itself could contain what he was doing, and he was gone by Thursday. He married Danielle 11 months later. I found out from Facebook, the way you find out most things you wish you hadn't gone looking for. I fell apart for the better part of a year. My sister Meredith moved in for 6 weeks because I stopped answering my phone and she got scared enough to just show up. I went to therapy with a psychologist named Dr. Owen Castellanos, who specialized in trauma and adjustment following limb loss, and who told me something in our 3rd session that I still think about. "The hardest part of what you're grieving," he said, "isn't just the arm. It's that his leaving turned the arm into proof of something. Proof that you'd become someone worth leaving. That's not true, but it's going to feel true for a long time. And I want you to know that in advance so it doesn't surprise you when it shows up." Every time I remembered Paul's face the night he left, carefully blank, already halfway out the door in his head. Meredith stayed those 6 weeks longer than either of us expected. She learned to help me with things I hated needing help with, without ever once making me feel like a burden about it. Buttoning a shirt cuff, opening a stubborn jar, sitting quietly on bad nights instead of filling the silence with reassurances I didn't believe yet. She never once told me Paul was a mistake I'd get over. She just kept showing up, which turned out to matter more than anything anyone said. They needed patient collaborators who understood both the engineering problem and what it actually felt like to live with the loss. I had an engineering degree from before I ever thought I'd need it for myself. I applied on a whim, half convinced I wasn't qualified, mostly hoping it would give my days a shape again. Dr. Priya Anand, the lead researcher, 15 years in neural interface design, interviewed me for 2 hours and hired me on the spot as a research associate, not just a subject. "Most of my engineers have never worn what they're designing," she told me. "You have. That's not a disadvantage in this lab. That's the entire point. 4 years of testing prototypes that failed in small, humiliating ways before they worked. Sensors that misfired. Grip patterns that took 11 attempts to hold a coffee cup without crushing it. Feedback algorithms that had to be rebuilt from scratch twice. I fell in love with the problem the way you fall in love with something that's actually going to save you, slowly, through repetition, not through a single dramatic moment. In year 2, I co-authored my first patent application for a pressure mapping algorithm that let the prosthetic distinguish between a firm handshake and an accidental bump, small distinctions that turned out to matter enormously for anyone trying to live an ordinary life with an extraordinary hand. In year 3, I started building a public speaking career almost by accident, invited to a regional conference to talk about designing prosthetics from the inside. The talk went well enough that I got invited to another one, then another. By year 4, I had co-founded a small company with Dr. Anand, licensing our sensory feedback technology to 2 major prosthetics manufacturers. I wasn't rich, but I had built something that mattered, with my own hands, one of them technically not mine at all, and somehow more mine than anything I'd ever used before. My prosthetic hand, the newest generation model, the one I'd helped design myself, held a champagne flute without a single tremor because I'd calibrated the grip pressure myself 6 weeks earlier. I felt the specific sensation of being watched from a fixed point, instead of glanced at in passing. I turned. Paul stood 15 feet away in a rented tuxedo, name tag reading guest of Danielle Reyes Whitfield, his firm apparently a sponsor table for the evening. His face had gone the color of old paper. He was staring at my hand. Small world. I haven't spoken to anyone in your social circle in 6 years. Nobody in your world has any legitimate way of knowing anything specific about my recovery. How much do you actually know about the last 6 years of my life? After that, nothing. No shared providers, no emergency contact status, no records release anywhere in any file, because I'd removed him from every one of them within weeks of him leaving, on my lawyer's advice at the time. The detail he'd used struggled, specifically after a description vague enough to seem secondhand but confident enough to seem sourced, nagged at me for days. I called Meredith. Did you ever talk to Paul after he left? Why would I? That's it. Our lab had partnered with a regional prosthetics manufacturer for 2 years running trials on the sensory feedback device. The same manufacturer, it turned out, that supplied devices through Paul's firm's corporate wellness program, an employee benefit Paul's firm had adopted after Danielle joined its board of directors. Employee dependents with qualifying conditions had access to a case management service through that benefit, which included consultations with outside specialists. Dr. Anand pulled up the manufacturer's client intake records during an unrelated billing reconciliation and noticed my name flagged under an old research consultation from 3 years earlier, a consultation I had given, unpaid, as a professional favor to a case manager who wanted patient perspective input on device selection for a beneficiary. I remembered the call. I hadn't asked who the beneficiary was, because that information wasn't mine to ask for. The beneficiary's employer-sponsored plan was listed under Whitfield, Cole & Barrow, Paul's firm. I hadn't given anyone details about my own life, but I had, unknowingly, spoken with a case manager who had access to Paul's employee benefits file on the same day, in the same department, where notes on unrelated calls sometimes sat in shared folders longer than they should have. Her findings: a case manager named Todd Ellery, handling Whitfield, Cole & Barrow's wellness benefit account, had pulled my name from an internal consultation log and referenced it informally in a phone call with a beneficiary's spouse, Paul, who had called in asking, unprompted, off the record, whether the woman who'd consulted on his firm's prosthetics benefit years ago was doing all right these days. He did it anyway, casually, the way people share office gossip without registering it as a privacy violation, because Paul had made it sound like harmless curiosity about an old acquaintance, rather than what it actually was. Paul had used his own company's benefits system and a stranger's professional carelessness to check up on the woman he'd left in a hospital bed 6 years earlier, not out of concern, I'd come to understand, but because some part of him needed a status update he could feel superior to. He'd gotten one word, struggled, and built an entire private narrative around it, one where I was still the woman he'd left behind, unfinished, worse off, justifying the decision he'd made. He hadn't updated that narrative in 3 years. HIPAA didn't apply directly. I wasn't Paul's patient or dependent, but the contract's own privacy clause did, and it was airtight enough that the firm's outside counsel didn't bother arguing otherwise. Todd Ellery was terminated within 2 weeks. The manufacturer's compliance office issued Whitfield, Cole & Barrow a formal breach notice, which under the terms of their vendor contract triggered a mandatory internal review of who at the firm had solicited the disclosure. That review put Paul's name in a file at his own company, in his own department, reviewed by his own firm's ethics committee, a body he had, in an unrelated context, once sat on himself. I never asked for him to be fired. I didn't need to. His own firm's compliance process did the asking for me, and it asked in exactly the procedural, humorless language firms use when they'd rather quietly manage a problem than let it become a lawsuit. I already knew, from Meredith's locker room friend of a friend, that he'd been quietly moved off the firm's board-facing accounts the same week. I never spoke to Paul again after that night at the gala. I think about that word sometimes, struggled, and what it meant that he'd built 6 years of quiet superiority on a single secondhand syllable, never once bothering to update it, never once curious enough to actually ask me himself. He had needed me broken to make sense of leaving. I was standing at a podium in front of 300 people, describing a hand I'd helped build with my own mind, and he was standing in the back of the room in a rented tuxedo, holding a drink he'd stopped drinking from. The last thing I saw, walking off that stage to applause, was Danielle pulling him toward the exit by the sleeve, his face still doing the thing faces do when the ground turns out not to be where they left it. My phone buzzed in my clutch before I even reached the green room, a text from Meredith. Danielle just texted me, she wants to talk, says there's something about Paul you need to know before it's public.